School of Design. Questions surrounding museum practice, data collection methods, archival systems, and narrative have guided our project as we work through understanding our own personal history, the disparities and inequities that exist within that, and a move towards identifying just practices that elevate the voices of marginalized communities. To begin, we recognize that Harvard University is situated on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag nations. Historically, these lands have long served as a site of meeting, exchange, and diplomacy among Indigenous nations. We recognize the descendants of these nations, in addition to the variety of Native American people living, working, and contributing to the city of Boston. We would like to thank GSD professors Malkit Shoshan, Dan Borelli, and our cohort of outstanding scholars, designers, and artists at the Harvard Graduate School of Design for all of their encouragement and support through this process. In addition, we extend our sincere gratitude to the Research Center for Contemporary Native American Art at the Institute of American Indian Art, the Harvard University Native American Program for their technical assistance in making this event happen, the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective, and the Kaish Makers Fund for their gracious sponsorship support of this event. If you missed our first panel, we will be posting all conversations to the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective's YouTube channel, and we will add a link to the chat momentarily. Additionally, this project will culminate in a report which will be ready towards the end of May. It will bring together reflections from our conversation today. We will be having an open call for this publication, so feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to submit your work to be included in this. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the COVID crisis back home in India right now. I know many of you are joining us from there, and I hope that you and your loved ones are safe. South Asian student organizations across the United States, including at the Harvard Business School, Kennedy School, and the GSD, have collaborated to set up a fundraiser for assisting COVID relief work in India. So I'll add the link. Heidi put it in right now. The link is in the chat if you'd like to contribute. So now the topic of this panel. This panel explores issues related to Indigenous data sovereignty and provenance through the lens of restorative measures currently being introduced and employed in communities around the world. Often unseen and underestimated, data systems utilized by museums are at the core of problematic methods applied in the process of accession and archiving material culture. These systems hold a great deal of power as the misinformation or absence of information contained therein pose enduring challenges that often adversely affect marginalized populations. I'm excited to introduce our two speakers for today, Jane Anderson. Jane Anderson is an associate professor at New York University in Lenapehoking, which is New York, and global fellow in the Engelberg Center for Innovation, Law, and Policy in the Law School at NYU. Jane has a PhD in law and works on intellectual and cultural property law, Indigenous rights, and the protection of Indigenous traditional knowledge and cultural heritage. For the last 20 years, Jane has been working for and with Indigenous communities to find, access, control, and regain authority and ownership of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property collections and data within universities, libraries, museums, and archives. Jane is co-founder of Local Context, which she delivers the TK or traditional knowledge and BC or biocultural labels and notices. She's also the co-founder of Enrich. Maui Hudson, and I'm going to ask Maui to introduce himself and where he's from, because just out of respect for my inability to do so.
Kia ora, everyone. My affiliation is with the Whakatohia Nation, which is one of the Māori tribes here in New Zealand. And I'm currently based at the Te Kotahi Research Institute, which is a Māori Research Institute at the University of Waikato.
Maui is focusing on application of Māori to decision-making across a range of contemporary contexts, from new technologies to health, the environment to innovation. Maui supports Maori to engage in the research sector as a co-convener of Sing Aotearoa, the New Zealand chapter of the Summer Internship for Indigenous Genomics, and the Te Ahu o Rehua, a network for cross-cultural ocean knowledge, connecting expertise across the fields of climate change, marine science, ocean health, voyaging, and non-instrumental navigation. Maui also advocates for Maori rights and interests through Maori Data Sovereignty Network and Global Indigenous Data Alliance. He is a co-founder of Enrich, a joint initiative between the University of Waikato and New York University, and a co-developer of the Biocultural Labels Initiative. Just before I hand it over to them to begin, I wanted to point out that we will have time for questions afterwards at the end of the panel. So please use the Q&A to submit any thoughts or questions that you might have. Thank you so much, Jane and Maui, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Divya, and I want to say thank you to Heidi and Divya for this invitation to be here, and to the Harvard Native Studies program for hosting us, and especially for Heidi and Divya for framing the questions that we're here to think through with you. I'm coming from Tumbalong, or what is currently known as Darling Harbour, lands of the Gadigal people of the Oro Nation. I want to do this acknowledgement as part of making visible histories of settler colonialism and the violence that comes with that, and the dispossession of lands and knowledge that inform the work that Maui and I are going to be talking to you about today.
Kia ora, and I just while I've already referred to my sort of tribal affiliations myself, I live in Hamilton, New Zealand, which is the lands of the Waikato Tainui people. So just adding my acknowledgements there as well. So I'll share the screen and we can get underway. So yeah, so what we want to talk about is the local context program, the local context project, and the traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. And that's something that has developed over a number of years, but just its role in supporting Indigenous rights and interests and data, which has become, a topic of more recent interest. And it emerges from really an intersection of a couple, some different places. And I think you've been talking about museum practices, the way collections have happened, and how that has a strong, very colonial history to the way that those institutions were developed, and that Indigenous communities have enormous collections that sit within all of these different places, whether they're archives, museums, libraries, and the information that was collected and used to describe those collections has often been framed from the point of view of the collector or the institution themselves. And there's often significant information, whether that's individual names or community names, provenance information that's missing. When you think about that alongside the fact that those communities or Indigenous peoples are largely not the legal rights holders, that means that issues of responsibility and ownership, as well as the mistakes that are sitting there in the metadata, they become embedded as those collections become digitized. And that shift from having to go to, physically go to the institution to access the information, which was a little bit of a physical limitation to how widely spread it was, to now where we're in this era of open data and open science, where records get digitized and now they're accessible to everyone in the world. And this is not just an issue for those historic collections, but also for new data sets, because researchers are working on these collections and adding data and adding samples to it, both from out of the institutions, but within communities themselves. So in that sense, it's a growing problem. And it's one which is being challenged to some degree by the emerging discourse around Indigenous data sovereignty. And this is a discourse about what sorts of rights and interests Indigenous communities have in their own in Indigenous data. and strongly advocates for greater Indigenous control of Indigenous data. And it has this foundation in ideas that emerge out of Indigenous rights, treaty rights, intellectual property rights, and also Indigenous research ethics. And so the two sort of fundamental themes which get discussed are one, data for governance, and two, governance of data. So data for governance is really about access, and on the basis that the opportunity for communities to make use of their own data, to make use, to support the decisions which they need to make to support their lives and livelihoods is connected to the ability to access that data. And the other one, as that information is being made more widely available and accessible to others, to what degree are communities able to participate in the governance of that data and decisions about who else should get access to it, so that they can ensure that its use is relevant and responsive to their needs. And so you can see here the two publications. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Towards an Agenda was released in 2016, and the more recent Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy was released last year. And so if Indigenous data sovereignty, strongly focuses on control, and that aligns, really closely to the sorts of principles that have been advocated out of Canada with the OCAP principles. But we know that most Indigenous data is sitting in other institutions where you don't have the opportunity to be in possession of it, to assert ownership over it. And so we end up in the situation where we need to influence the governance of that data. And so that was where the care principles for Indigenous data governance were developed alongside the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And that was focused on these, it was developed partly in response to the use of the FAIR principles, and that we're supporting the open data and open science movement. So those principles were really focused on the really data-centric principles. What are the characteristics of the data which allow it to be shared more widely? And we realized when we looked at the Indigenous data sovereignty principles that were emerging, that they were more about the people and more about the purpose. And so you have these principles here around collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, which sit really nicely as complementary principles to the FAIR principles. And it's not a situation where it's an either or, because even for Indigenous communities, we want data to be fair. We want to be able to find our data wherever it's sitting in these different places. We want to be able to access it. So there's elements of FAIR that suit Indigenous outcomes too. And so our recent work through the Global Indigenous Data Alliance has then been starting to think about how the care principles can be operationalized and what sorts of activities and practices, tools and mechanisms can be used to support that. And we've realized it's likely to be a many-to-many relationship, and that there'll be a mechanism which will support probably a number of the expression of a number of the principles. And there'll be lots of different mechanisms that can contribute to how those mechanisms get realized, or those principles get realized as well. And in that context, the work that Jane had initiated around the traditional knowledge labels and the use of notices was something that actually can give expression to Indigenous the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the Local Context Project, and just as kind of a background to that, it kind of is informed by concern for, as kind of Maui mentioned before, that Indigenous communities largely don't own their collections within institutions. And the reason behind that is because of intellectual property law. And intellectual property law, like real property law, functions as a tool of colonial dispossession. it serves to disconnect and to dispossess Indigenous people of ownership and control over knowledge and culture, and leaves the possession within institutional contexts. So what informed this project initially was concern for how to regain control under those conditions. And within a kind of intellectual property framework, we have standard intellectual property, and then we have Creative Commons, and Creative Commons really doesn't do much for Indigenous collections because you have to be an owner in order to use Creative Commons licenses. And that really led us to try and start thinking about a different kind of initiative, which is where we moved to the TK labels, or the traditional knowledge labels and notices, as a direct intervention to bring Indigenous rights and make them visible and part of any kind of management of collections into the future. So the traditional knowledge labels were developed about 10 years ago now, slowly as an iterative process with community partners across multiple countries, really developing, and there's 18 TK labels. They're human readable and machine readable digital tags that allow communities to assert cultural protocols, permissions, provenance information back into the historical record, to really help users of those collections understand the responsibilities and the obligations that they have around using Indigenous collections into the future. So this is an example of the attribution labels. So I think I said there were 18 TK labels. This is the attribution label, and this is how the system works. There's an icon, and that icon remains stable. You can't change the icon, but under the icon is where communities are able to customize and to be able to describe in their own language and in their own way what attribution means from a community standpoint. So this is an example of the Scowlitz traditional knowledge label. Scowlitz being a band of the Stolo First Nation in British Columbia, what is now known as Canada. And they've described attribution as squik squas tektamuk in their language, in Hulkamalum, which literally means name and place. And under this you can really get a sense of why the Scowlitz are using this label, partly because the histories have not been told properly, partly because they want, moving into the future, the recognition that they should be attributed as the owners and who controls their knowledge and history into the future. So this is an example of a couple of the other labels that we've developed. The attribution label I just spoke about, and almost every community that we work with customizes the attribution label first. We also have labels like the culturally sensitive label that is used. We have a sacred label, which is often used more around NAGPRA related materials, and also particular materials that are not necessarily subject to NAGPRA, but have religious and cultural significance and need to be treated with care and not necessarily circulated. But we also have the culturally sensitive label, and that was developed because of community requests for a particular kind of identification of material that has cultural sensitives around it because of histories of colonialism, particularly around language materials, also documents that have derogatory descriptions around it, census records that have derogatory descriptions around them. So just letting people know that this material has sensitivities and needs to be treated with care. We also have the traditional knowledge seasonal label, and this is an interesting label partly because it brings knowledge back to place, knowledge back to land, that there are land-based teachings that are embedded within particular kinds of material within archives and libraries. For instance, particular kinds of songs should only be sung at a certain kind of the year. Certain songs for harvesting sweetgrass, for instance, should only be sung during sweetgrass harvesting time. Certain kinds of stories should only be told at a particular time of the year. Bear stories shouldn't be told during winter. And this label really kind of gives nuance and guidance in relationship to how certain kinds of material that are sitting with institutions should be used, that is respectful and recognises the obligation around Indigenous knowledge systems and how this should be used. This is an example of another example of how some of the labels are being utilised at the moment. This is syllabus in Tasmania, at the University of Tasmania, and it's a part of indigenising the curriculum. And this has been done with Palawa, with the Indigenous community in Tasmania, Palawa, and bringing Indigenous worldviews into the curriculum and using the labels to kind of indicate that this is being done in the right way and according to Palawa expectations for use and Palawa expectations for education and sharing the information that is part of this curriculum. You're muted, Maui.
Just trying to be respectful. Hey, so I just want to give an example here of the, well, actually probably one of the prime examples of the use of the traditional knowledge labels. And it's one that sits between the Passamaquoddy tribe and the Library of Congress. And it relates to 31 wax cylinders that were created in the 1890s as part of testing the technology. It was a new technology at the time around recordings. And this was the first ever recordings made on native lands. And so these recordings are now in the Library of Congress, and you can see here the online catalogue and the information that's set alongside it. And the only thing that references the community here is the name Passamaquoddy, and nothing else that sits in this record gives any indication of what material is in there. You can see that in the rights advisory that the rights are held by the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. But other than that, everything else is really more about the technology and the format which the songs are in. And as the community engage with the Library of Congress to really think about what an enriched record might look like, and how the labels might be applied, they ended up with this kind of record. And this is the record that sits there now. And you see there's a lot more information and traditional knowledge, which comes from the community itself, which they've been able to add to the record, which is still open to everyone. So it's enriched the record for the public at large. And the community were comfortable about adding that material to this public record because the traditional knowledge labels are sitting right there. It's very visible what their interests and what their permissions are around its use being for outreach and its use being non-commercial, and that attribution label that talks about how it connects back to their communities in place. And so this becomes the public facing record which people can see. And there's a couple more pages of information, traditional knowledge, which the community have shared, which now sits in this record as well. But one of the really interesting things for me as I was introduced to the labels was seeing the sorts of things that then happened alongside that. And this was one of them, the fact that the traditional knowledge labels could be recognized within the rights advisory. And sitting there as the first rights, even though they're not intellectual property rights, those intellectual property rights are held by the Peabody Museum, and you see them sitting below. But they can be recognized as cultural intellectual property rights alongside the intellectual property rights. And this is really important in terms of the transparency to the public of what these different rights are and how they may relate to each other. Alongside that is then the need to make changes in the infrastructures of the Library of Congress as well. And so making changes in those digital infrastructures which allow traditional knowledge labels to be reflected, and they're sitting here within the MARC record under the 540 field, which is connected to rights as well. And you see the Peabody Museum rights sitting below in the same field. And again, how that then connects into the Dublin core, and it's the labels are sitting within the rights fields within the Dublin core. So part of how this comes about is that even though there was 31, quite a discrete collection, 31 cylinders, they've had to make changes to the infrastructure, and this is in the JSON file, where there's now space for traditional knowledge labels. So any item within the Library of Congress can now have traditional knowledge labels added to it. And I think that's the really interesting element where you create an enabling infrastructure. And now the infrastructure within the Library of Congress allows for this sort of recognition of Indigenous rights to occur. Now, that will have to happen over time as other communities start to make use of it, but that ability exists in right now.
So the other example that we want to bring to this conversation that we think is probably useful and interesting is around the work that's being done with the Penobscot Nation, establishing authority over collections within universities. So the Penobscot have a particular kind of research board that reviews research. I think everyone will have come across Linda Tuwai-Smith's work and thinking about decolonizing methodologies. And one of the things that Linda talks about within very early within that book is how research is one of the dirtiest words in an Indigenous vocabulary, partly because it's understood as a project of extraction. And so this is similar for how Penobscot have experienced research. And so they established a Penobscot Tribal Research and Review Protection Board, or Perturbed, as James Francis calls it, Penobscot Nation, in order to kind of review research that is ongoing and people come to the community and want to do increasing research, and it needs to go through a tribal review board. One of the projects that the Penobscot have embarked on over the last couple of years was not only engaging with finding and engaging with their language materials, which are held in the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, but also working with the University of Maine. So in 2018, next slide, please. Now, in 2018, Penobscot Nation signed a memorandum of understanding with the University of Maine around the collections that are held within the university. This is a significant agreement, partly because it was the first time that the University of Maine acknowledged that the lands of the University of Maine were the traditional Penobscot lands, Penobscot territories. So that was written into the Memorandum of Understanding. But beyond that, it also started to deal with the different parts of the university that are engaged with Penobscot collections. So the Hudson Museum, the library, the anthropology department, the press. The press had published books on Penobscot Nation, but had not involved or engaged Penobscot Nation around verifying particular parts of those publications. And also the Institutional Review Board, having Penobscot members sit on the Institutional Review Board to actually be part of those conversations around any research that goes through the IRB that involves Penobscot people. So one of the parts that was written into the Memorandum of Understanding was using the TK labels on the collections within the library. And what's happened as a result of this since 2018 is a real commitment by the library to start incorporating TK labels, or the Penobscot TK labels, into the library collections at large. And this starts to bring Penobscot voice, Penobscot authority into a place where it had hardly been before. And so that starts to change the relationships and starts to change how those collections are understood into the future as holding Penobscot authority. Another part of the work that the Penobscot has been doing is, I think we often think that collections are just in the past, that collections aren't still coming into institutions, that collections aren't still being made. And so one of the pieces of work that we've been doing with Penobscot is developing a future acquisitions agreement for collections and data between the Penobscot Nation and various different institutions. And so what this starts to do is kind of starts to change or starts to shift how these collections come in and to what extent the Penobscot are involved from the very moment that those collections come into an institution, so that they aren't hidden in the ways that we're kind of still trying to find Penobscot collections into the future. Next slide, Maui. So within this agreement, this is a template document that any community can actually use. It starts talking about, in the first instance, institutions' obligation is to see if that collection can be transferred, or the ownership of that collection can be transferred to the community. If that's not possible, then the use of the TK labels starts to become an option, and also the different kinds of recognition in the ways in which the collection gets managed, that the community has control and authority over that collection and data in perpetuity.
And so one of the other places where we saw a need for recognition of Indigenous rights and interests was around genetic resources, around Indigenous flora and fauna. And that had been an area which I've been quite involved with developing guidelines for, genomic research with Māori, biobanking with Māori. We're just releasing some guidelines around genomic research on Indigenous flora and fauna. And in that space, there were these challenges around recognizing Indigenous rights and interests to that digital sequence information, particularly as that tends to be shared, or the usual practice is for it to be shared within kind of open data platforms. And so how would you collaborate around ethical access and use in ways consistent with community protocols, so that you're in a position to negotiate equitable outcomes from the use and potential commercialization? And this is where it starts to connect into things like the Nagoya Protocol. So we've developed or initiated a process of developing some bicultural labels. This is the first set of 6 labels that have been developed in this context, and really using the same sort of framework and platform that have been developed for the traditional knowledge labels, but applying it to genetic resources. And you'll see here we use the term provenance rather than attribution, but follow in a similar sort of way with the same sort of format. Probably one of the differences in relation to this is that as we don't have sort of traditional protocols as it relates to the sharing of genetic information in that way, we're thinking about its use into the future. And so the idea of being able to indicate to next users that you're open to collaboration or open to commercialization, and inviting them to come and engage with you in the same way as Jane was just talking about around future acquisitions, those future activities and how they can be facilitated through the use of the labels. And so I'm not going to talk about these other than, they operate in a similar sort of way for each of the labels. There's a why use this label. We provide some label template text, which communities can use as a sort of a foundation on which to develop their own text, or they can do their own thing. They're available in Spanish and French and Te Reo Māori as well.
So as we've been developing the labels, which are distinctly for communities to customize and to deliver to institutions to assert their sovereign interests and authority over collections, we understood that there needed to be a particular kind of tool for institutions and for researchers. Often researchers are sitting at that interface with Indigenous communities before collections end up in institutions, so they have a responsibility to be disclosing Indigenous rights and interests in that moment that they're producing collections, but also that institutions have a responsibility to make visible and to help find Indigenous collections. So earlier Maui was talking about the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And we know that Indigenous collections rarely are fair. So thinking through what are the mechanisms or the tools that could be developed that help institutions do the work that allows Indigenous communities to get access to find their collections and to kind of make them visible and bring them to the surface so that they can actually start labeling them. So we developed the Attribution Incomplete and the Open to Collaborate as very particular institutional tools. The Open to Collaborate notice allows institutions to indicate that they're willing to do this work, they're willing to commit to a different kind of process, to a decolonial process, thinking what a decolonial future or decolonial elsewhere could be. And the Attribution Incomplete recognises that there's missing information within the collection within the metadata for a particular kind of item. The biocultural notice and the traditional knowledge notice indicate that there are Indigenous interests within collections and within research. So they are kind of more the researcher tools, though they can also use the attribution incomplete and open to collaborate notices as well. So this is just an example of the open to collaborate notice being used at Simon Fraser University on the Northwest Coast Image Archive. Again, a disclosure of Indigenous rights and interests is really what the notices are working to do. This is the most visited photo collection at Simon Fraser University, and they know that their collection is relatively impoverished in the sense that it hasn't had full engagement with Northwest Coast communities. And so this is kind of a signal to not only the communities that SFU wants to do this work, but also to the broader public, that there is an ongoing project of addressing these colonial absences and erasures within the archive itself. This is an example at the Abbey Museum in Maine of the use of both the open to collaborate and the attribution incomplete on the online record. The open to collaborate has been added to every single item, so this is at an item level. And then in other instances, the open to collaborate and the attribution incomplete notice have been added.
And here is an example of how it's now being applied into sort of more scientific spaces. And so this is GEOME, which is the Genomic Observatory's metadatabase. It's a metadata database for geological and genetic sequences. And you'll see here the open to collaborate label, which has been attached to their website. And within the system, so as researchers come and want to add data about collections which they've been involved with gathering, the gene sequence data sits within a sort of a genomics database, dbGaP, some other ones, but the metadata associated with those gene sequences is located within this database. And here you see they've created the option for people to add a traditional knowledge notice to the records which they're putting together. And that automatically creates the definition on the side. We're working closely with them so that as those traditional knowledge notices are created here, the metadata which is being put in place here can come through the local context hub, and we can generate a notice from that hub as well. And this is what the general process would look like. A researcher or an institution would be wanting to add one of the notices to the material, could do so by going to the local context hub, putting in information about that project, and then having that notice be in a position to be added to the records in whichever place that it's at, in a very similar manner to what Jane's just indicated with the Simon Fraser and the Abbey Museum. The communities, if they're known, if the communities that related to the material are known, can be sent a notification. Either if they're a user of the hub themselves, it will go there automatically. It can be emailed to them. And then they're in a position to think about whether they want to add labels to that record. And so if they decide to add a label, whether it's a provenance label or something else, then that label will follow through using the ID created with the notice and replace it in all of those, in all of the places where it's been located.
So what this starts to move towards as well is the obligations and responsibilities of researchers and transforming practices so that there is a different framework for recognising and disclosing that there are Indigenous rights and interests within research. This starts to speak to the ways in which that feeds through into contexts like publication. So part of our work has been working with publications like Nature, who are interested in thinking about how they actually make that disclosure of interest visible within publications themselves. And of course, how that disclosure starts to change how any public reader is thinking about the processes behind the production of research. This also starts to change how ORCID as a particular kind of entity that works for researchers can also be part of a system for recognizing and making transparent the way in which research is conducted with Indigenous people.
And so what I want to just give you is a little bit of an example of a project that's happening with our community. So what you have here is sort of the boundaries of our community's territory. So this is the Whakatohia Nation. This is the east coast of the North Island. If you've got any idea what New Zealand looks like. And our area both on land, but out into the sea. And so we have engaged in a collaborative research project, which is looking at marine heat waves. And that's of particular interest to us because the green boxes there in the sea represent the spaces where we have commercial aquaculture interests. And we know that changes in temperature in the ocean have a great effect on our ability to, or the health and viability of the mussels which we grow in that space. And so the other component to the project, or in particularly an interest here in New Zealand now, is the role of traditional knowledge in informing research. And so often within research projects, there'll be a component, even if it's a scientific project, have a component that relates to traditional knowledge. And so our community is bringing that into the context of this project too. And so across our coastline, we know there are areas of significance, historical significance, significance for the sorts of resources we got from there, and those are reflected within one of our traditional songs, and that's been used. And all of the points you see here are places that are referenced within our traditional song. And so we've been using the traditional knowledge labels in this context to talk about not only in the same way that, you know, the attribution and connection of this knowledge to our community, that it's something that's been verified by our community, but that the song itself should only be sung by community members. So we have a community use only label attached to that. We're comfortable with the information that emerges from the song, which we then talk about in a broader sense and can add different information being shared. We're really interested in the way in which we can then layer scientific information to that material around that space. But the song itself is for community use only. Alongside this, there's another component of the project, which is looking at sort of the genetic connectivity. And you'll see this is a sort of slightly zoomed out map, but showing the same area, and that we're wanting to sample mussels from right across that whole coastline, which starts to move into the territories of other communities as well. And so we've been going through that engagement process and consultation process with our neighboring tribes to get their permission for the actions to take place. But as that genetic data is generated, we're applying the biocultural labels to that material. And we're really looking forward to having this happen in a more automated way as the local context hub is being developed and about to enter its beta testing phase next week, with the ability for our community to go and to customize the labels. We did our first exercise of customizing the traditional knowledge labels last year when New Zealand was in the middle of its COVID lockdown. Fortunately for us, and Jane keeps reminding me, I can't talk about in that phase like a past tense, and acknowledgements to what Divya was talking about in terms of some of the current crises around other parts of the world, in India in particular, at the moment. But we had our sort of month-long lockdown early last year, and we were able to do the customization process for the traditional knowledge labels for our community over a Zoom meeting, by sharing information, sharing screens, working through the TK label hub at that time. And that's now just been transitioned into this new local context hub, so we can do the same thing with both the TK labels and the BC labels. And that's what you'll see here, our ability to go on and edit or customize both the biocultural and traditional knowledge labels.
So I think one of the ways in which we've come to understand and start thinking through the biocultural and traditional knowledge labels and notices is the different kinds of, is a taxonomy of them of sorts, in the sense that they're doing very particular kinds of work. So there are labels that are doing provenance work, there are labels that are doing protocols work, and there's labels that are doing permissions work. And I think in terms of understanding that, that's where we start seeing what the value of labeling collections and data is, in terms of how the labels meet certain kinds of expressions of Indigenous data sovereignty, particularly around connection, control, and governance, which is really fundamentally what we think provenance means and is for Indigenous data sovereignty interests. The protocols work as a particular kind of expression of IDSOV by enabling Indigenous worldviews within infrastructure, right? So they're doing particular kind of work in terms of educating user publics, as well as limiting inappropriate or derogatory use, and really allowing a space for education about Indigenous worldviews and different kinds of ways of thinking about how we are in the world and our relations to humans and non-humans. The permissions part is also, I think you could probably see from some of the biocultural labels in particular, this kind of moving into the future. What does future use mean? What does that start to think require? Well, it requires responsibility and transparency and integrity. And so here we start to see that the permissions are really an expression of Indigenous data sovereignty, really by supporting ethical and equitable research, transformative research, so that research happens in a way that actually reflects Indigenous expectations and the ways in which partnerships can build into the future with different kinds of outcomes and with benefits that actually come directly back to Indigenous communities.
And so one of the So I've realized that as we've been thinking about and working with different communities, but also different institutions around the application of the labels, is that people are thinking about where should the labels sit within their databases, and starting to think about what's required to create a standard. So, you know, whether it's the traditional knowledge labels or whether it's some other tool that supports, you know, provenance, recording provenance and within institutions and databases, that there should be some sort of standard that's created around that. And so we've engaged in a process with the IEEE, which is just initiated in the last year or so, to develop a recommended practice for the provenance of Indigenous people's data. That project that activity is underway at the moment. It's one that's open to anyone to participate in, and we've been thinking through the different ways in which provenance is understood from a Western point of view, but also how Indigenous people might think about provenance and how that needs to be reflected in the way that the recommended practice is described and developed. So, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Thank you very much. We're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Maui and Jane, for your presentation. We have actually several questions from our attendees in the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first question is, thank you very much for this presentation. Within participating Indigenous community, who exactly would have the power to assign particular TK or BC labels, especially the potentially more controversial labels, quote, open to collaboration or, quote, open to commercialization? Have you run into community disagreements around these labels in practice?
I'm happy to start that, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about the open to collaboration, open commercialization Maui. But so as we've kind of developed this project, we really leave those decision-making and governance, the decision-making governance decisions at a community level or at a tribal level. And I think what we've found is there are multiple answers to that question. It's such an important question. Sometimes the labels need to go through full tribal council approval. And that's a process that each tribe makes a decision about. Sometimes there are designated people within a community context that already have that authority. So for example, the Tribal Historical Preservation Officer, the TIPO, is often that already has that designated authority to kind of make some of those decisions. So it really depends on the community, and we don't have any role in relationship to how those decisions are made. That is at a community to community tribal sovereign decision-making level.
And so if I think about the context of my community, I'm on our tribal council, but it took 6 months of discussions with them before they were open to the idea of making use of the traditional knowledge labels and getting involved in a project. We're involved in a project at the moment, which is working with the National Sound and Film Archive, and it's around us repatriating or digitally repatriating material from that archive into our own digital library, and at the same time adding traditional knowledge labels, which will then sit on the National Archive. The people that were involved in the development or customizing of the label included board members as well as kind of staff members from the tribal organization. And I think it's been set as the label hub has been set up in a way so that it requires more than just a single person to do it, and it requires a recognition of some kind of authority. And this is important both for communities but also for institutions to know that actually you have the support of the institution or the community, or the community authority to operate in this way. Those internal processes around how they do it, as Jane said, we leave up to them. And in relation to what labels get applied in terms of future use, it's both their decision. What we were trying to do in the context of the open to collaborate and open to commercialize labels is recognize that and thinking about permissions for future use are really difficult, because you don't know what that future use is, and you don't know what the potential uses could be as well. But you're wanting to ensure that if something comes up, and often this is in the context of data which is going to be publicly available anyway, so it can be used, and you can have can be essentially misappropriated without your knowledge. We're trying to ensure that if someone wants to do something, they know who they should go and talk to. And often what we hear, in sort of research spaces is go, oh, look, I would have liked to do, but I didn't know who I needed to talk to. And so this starts to remove that plausible deniability sort of argument from the discussion.
I had a question actually that's unrelated to the museum scene, but is definitely related to data collection practices. I recently worked on a project at the Kennedy School with the New Mexico Indian Affairs Department, and assisting them with their Missing Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force initiative. And one of the issues that came up in that project, and I think nationally, not just within New Mexico, but also, throughout the U.S. and in Canada, among First Nations and Indigenous communities, is this issue of data collection and all these gaps that are that pose a lot of challenges in terms of collecting accurate information on missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. And so I'm just curious, as this is something that I think more tribal nations are taking a look at and developing policies. And now that we have Deb Holland leading this initiative from this high governmental position, are you able to speak a little bit about how, if you're aware of how Indigenous communities are looking at the ways in which data is shared on these types of issues? And because I really imagine, having worked on this, that it's kind of going to be a hairy issue, and I don't know that a lot of communities have really thought about developing plans in terms of this push towards more effective data collection practices.
Yes, I think there's a couple of sort of intersecting issues that sit in that space. One is, certainly issues around the quality of data, and that's that's often a data collection issue, and one that has to be worked on in a variety of different ways. You've then also got sort of a data sharing issue, and often a data sharing issue is related to a data linkage issue, and so people starting to link different data sets together so that they can come up with, I guess, and all sorts of other insights and understandings. And it really comes down to the way in which that happens. And, even around our colleagues with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance were involved with putting together some of the COVID data guidance that was put out by the Research Data Alliance, which was thinking about, how we're promoting data sharing so that, people can respond appropriately to the COVID crisis. But a number of, First Nations, American Indian communities were feeling exposed by some of the practices around how that information was being shared and how it was being used to stigmatize or target their communities. And so the ways in which data then can be used by others as it becomes open does create create potential issues. And so I think there is a much stronger view emerging across some of those communities, and certainly some here in New Zealand, about they're being much more forceful about how they get to participate in those governance decisions and access decisions around the use of data, even if it's state or federal data.
And so I would just add to that I think it's such an important question that you're raising there, Heidi. I think that there's a lot of communities that are in the process of internally developing Indigenous data governance boards at a tribal level. This is training that is also delivered by one of our colleagues, Stephanie Carroll, in relationship to how tribes develop their own frameworks to manage data, but both the collection of data, but also the control and governance of data. We're running training around for the Saginaw Chippewa Indigenous Data Governance Board in the next 3 months. So there's different kinds of ways in which the Saginaw Chippewa will start building out what their governance around data that's both collected by them but also by others can be managed within a kind of community context, in order to kind of so that Saginaw Chippewa can actually derive benefit from the data that is generated and collected by them, but also that they're part of decision-making processes in relationship to how that data is produced in the first place. So that's happening across the country, and certainly through Native Nations Institute is also offering training around data governance for tribes as well.
Thank you so much. We do have some more additional questions in the chat. We have one that says, this may be of interest to both of you and or to the whole audience. The Peabody Museum has been in conversation recently with the Pacific Virtual Museum Project, which, while focused on collectively sharing oceanic cultural heritage, resources held in museum institutions around the world, has also been grappling with some of the notions of how to handle data presentation and rights. Have you worked with them to date?
So if it is the same one, there has been conversation which we've had with the Pacific Virtual Museum, partly because I think it's a project that's been funded out of Australia, but is a group in New Zealand's been involved with developing it, and we had some early conversations with them about the potential to use notices and labels as a part of that project. Partly because it was, as a virtual museum, it was essentially taking material from a whole lot of other places and using it as a sort of an aggregating that and as a kind of a different front end channel. And so this is, that really this process of as, what do you call, over existing information data sets, or creating opportunities for it to come about, and creating also opportunities to start thinking about engagement with those communities and having them contribute to the records that might exist or the information that might exist around them.
We have a couple more questions. There's one that says, can you please speak more about the implications of MOU if you've had issues or success with adherence to them, since I don't think they are legally binding? Hopefully, institution engaging in a MOU would not be looking to break this, but looking at the record. Institutions have tended to listen to, quote, the law over Indigenous people. Thank you.
Another great question. So we largely use memorandums of understanding as a beginning point, as starting a partnership, starting a different kind of relationship. They do sit in a certain kind of murky grey zone in relationship to being legally enforceable. They sometimes can be, sometimes aren't. But they really utilise the area of contract law and agreements in order to kind of start making different kinds of obligations and relationships possible. And in a way, because, for example, the MOU that I was talking about with the University of Maine and the Penobscot Nation, what was significant about that was that both the chief of the Penobscot Nation, Chief Kirk Francis, and the president of the university signed that MOU. So there's a certain kind of responsibility that act of coming together to do that work was opening, and from that there has been significant change within the university, but also on the campus in terms of how Penobscot Nation is recognised on the campus. That kind of did require some kind of formal agreement or a kind of formal recognition, which is kind of what the MOU did, and then also how that's filtered down into different parts of the institution as well. We don't necessarily see MOUs as ends in themselves, and I think as that question kind of points to, institutions will tend to listen to the law. What it does is it gets people at the table in a way that they haven't been at the table previously, and in that there starts to be a different kind of possibility for partnerships and moving things forward. So we use MOUs as a particular kind of strategy, certainly not as an end, but as a beginning.
And if I can add, both the use of the labels and then some of these other tools are really about trying to create sort of relational responsibilities. So, and making transparent the fact that there is a relationship there that needs to be acknowledged, that you're sort of acknowledging that, these people have interest in the activities that are going on. Then it's actually just about how you are, essentially how you are as neighbors, as colleagues, as collaborators, whatever the nature of that relationship that's sort of being reflected as sovereign kind of partners, as sovereign entities and groups that are relating to each other. How it actually plays out and then how that has to be enforced is a different sort of question. And when you automatically go straight to a sort of an enforcement type of a question, and I know we're sort of working off a kind of a history of that thing happening, but it's often not conducive to having a good relationship. And so sometimes being able to work with mechanisms that don't have that element to them is a nice way to kind of move into things. Of course, we know that it's then necessary to be able to move into the places where then those conversations about power, about kind of legitimacy, about those things do come into play, but you can get there from this place as well.
Thank you for that. We have two questions. I'm going to kind of read them both because they both have to do with TK labels. The first is, does the TK label information which gets added to public-facing platforms get added back into institutions' original database? And the second is, for LOC, how did these new TK data structures come about? Speaking from the experience of frustration, even getting LOC subject headings revised for new tribal naming, for example.
So I'm happy to start with that last question first and kind of move to the other question. I think that it was just an incredibly unique circumstance. I totally have experienced how difficult it is to deal with Library of Congress subject headings and the enormous amount of incredible scholarship and Indigenous scholarship that has been done to disrupt and to kind of point to the bias that exists within the LOC subject headings. I think it was a unique circumstance in the sense that all the people that were involved in the project at the Library of Congress were committed to that change. And I think as it led to, as one part kind of unfolded, that then led to that second part within the data structures themselves. So first it was the MARC record, then it was the Dublin core, then it was JSON, and it just kind of like moved in that direction. It just kind of couldn't, I don't know, I don't know if also it's such significant change, and I don't know if it wasn't planned in that way. I guess it just was an inevitability of what the labels opened, and certainly once the labels were placed into a rights field, then the natural place for them to go within the data structures were in the rights field, and then that changed, you know, where Indigenous rights are going to be recognised and seen for that first time. And so in a way it was more of a cascading effect, partly because it just led from one part to that next. And so I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's the short answer, certainly. And I think when we initiated that project, I don't think that we knew that it would be as significant as it is. And we certainly didn't anticipate that it would require foundational change within the digital infrastructure itself. That just was an outcome of the project. And certainly for Passamaquoddy working on those wax cylinders, you know, here we are working on these really significant and treasured sound recordings. But that project has then enabled every community who has material within the Library of Congress to add TK labels now if they want to. And there are currently 8 communities doing that work at the moment. So just kind of what that opens and what that kind of possibility was, I don't think was necessarily anticipated, but certainly is an outcome that we'll take because it kind of moves things significantly and starts setting particular kinds of standards for that change. Just in relationship to that other question about the TK label information, which gets added to public-facing platforms, get added back into the institution's original database, we're starting to see that happen. Certainly projects like Mukatu, which comes out of Washington State University, is very invested in making sure that the metadata and the information that is created from a community standpoint is shared back into institution's original database. But importantly, that the community decides and makes the decisions about what information is shared and when, so that there are certain information isn't going to be shared. It's only for the community, and then some information is because it helps people understand that community in a different kind of way. But that decision must vest with the community. It's not a decision that's made at an institutional level.
And I think the other point I'd just like to add is, as we're setting up the local context hub as a place that you can create the labels and then share them. It's this relational element. So it's not an aggregator where we're going to take all the information that sits in the Library of Congress and take the information that sits in the sort of a tribal context and then put them together. You just connect them, and they're connected through another. The relationship between the tribe and the institution themselves is what will determine what information moves between them, in both ways, whether it's a sort of repatriation of information back into a kind of a tribal context and a sort of tribals' own sort of digital infrastructures, or the sort of information which they then want to share and place within that more public space. And for, when I'm thinking about it in the context of, sort of my community, we've got, we know that only 10% of our people live within our tribal boundaries. So that means that our ways of connecting with our own people require us to make that available in different ways, because they're right across New Zealand and right across the world.
Thank you so much for that. I think we have one last question. Can you talk about the women and men traditional knowledge labels? Have you seen a need for labels beyond the Western gender binary?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we do get that question quite regularly. So when the normative gender labels were developed, they came out of an Australian context, very, very strict protocols around gendered knowledge, and beyond kind of just gendered knowledge, then highly restricted knowledge for particular women and particular kind of men. So we have two kinds of restricted labels within the TK labels suite. And we do get questions around what, for instance, gender binary or gender non-binary two-spirit protocols might look like, and would we be able to develop labels around that? And it's something that is slowly being developed as we kind of work out what those protocols would be, and what traditionally within Indigenous community contexts permissions and protocols around two-spirit material might be. We haven't got a clear answer on that yet, so it's kind of one, like all the labels, they evolve through different kinds of communication and iteration with multiple communities. And so this is kind of coming up particularly in a US context, but not in an Australian context. So we're kind of thinking about how do these things kind of work across different Indigenous communities, which is kind of what the labels need to do. So we haven't got there yet. I wouldn't say that we're just kind of in a process that we'll see what that looks like as it emerges. But it's a great question, and we're very attentive to what that means and kind of what that could unfold for non-binary gender material and how it should be looked after into the future as well.
I'd say the other aspect to that is really, what's the process for developing new labels? And so each of the labels that's been developed has been specifically in response to a need of a tribal community. So they've had some sort of protocol or some sort of permission which they've needed to get across, which they've needed to reflect, which hasn't been captured by the existing labels. And so when that's come up, then the new labels developed, because it's in lots of ways it's around that, reflecting that purpose and reflecting that protocol. So as if there is a community, if there's a sort of a tribal community that decides there is important protocols that sit around that sort of activity, or any other ones that isn't reflected, then you sort of engage in a process of what the kind of what the boundaries and what the scope of that label might be in relation to the rest.
So just one last question on my side, which would be, what are some short-term and long-term data collection, labeling, and provenance-related practices that Harvard can initiate in addressing museum collection inequities?
You start, Jane.
Also, one of the things that we recommend is to start thinking about using the notices, right? The notices are just an initial step to indicate that there are problems, and that those problems need to be kind of talked about and made differently transparent in order to work towards different partnerships and relationships. I think the challenges that institutions like Harvard have is that they're sitting on collections that were created through violence and inequity. So how do we deal with that? And to deal with that means going into that history and going into that and kind of not glossing it over as some kind of colonial encounter. And I think that there are collections that have been stolen, taken, even images that circulate that shouldn't be circulating. So thinking about what does that look like and what kinds of policies need to be rewritten to address those particular kinds of challenges. I think it's also, and many institutions certainly do this, and I'm not familiar with Harvard's practices necessarily, but certainly creating advisory boards that can have input from communities that have been affected by those collections, and kind of what's within them is another start. But it's a slow process. Colonialism is a structure. It embeds itself in all kinds of processes, and the ways in which these collections have come into institutions is over really long periods of time. So it's going to take long periods of time to undo some of that work and to kind of think about. So I guess what I would say is it needs to be very deliberate. It needs to be very clear, it needs to be transparent, and it needs to have participation of people who have traditionally not been part of those conversations. That's where you start.
And just, the only thing I'd add, because I support all of those, is that to not get caught up in the enormity of it. Because often, we're sort of, in these conversations with some other institutions that are, thinking about how they should be, getting more involved in decolonial practices and thinking about how their collections have come together and what it means for them. And, you'll be dealing with millions and millions of samples. And so, as soon as you start thinking about that, it just all feels too big. But just like the exercise with the Library of Congress, it was a kind of a discrete piece of work that had been done that then created change within the infrastructure, which then allows the different relationships which need to advance to move in a hopefully a smoother way. And those relationships are take time, and so that's why this whole process tends to take a degree of time, but it needs to be done in a deliberate way, like Jane said, and it just needs to kind of continue and keep growing. And so I think that's the important bit. This having something like this is a great start for bringing some transparency and some thought to it, and then it's in what ways can we act. So our University of Waikato was recently called out by a number of academics for being a racist institution. They just had a task force released its report yesterday, and they know that it's going to be a bit of a journey for our institution to improve its practices. It's been quite good in some places and not good in others. But that commitment to improve practices is one thing. And when we've been talking to them about the application of the labels here, it's about what these to create. Well, they're calling it a PAR, but essentially, modeling in the physical infrastructure. So when you're coming on the campus, you can see something Māori sitting there, so that there's a visibility about Indigenous things in the physical infrastructure of the university. I was saying, actually, we also presence in that visibility in the digital infrastructures, and that'll only come about by making the same sorts of changes there as you might see in the kind of like that physical environment as well.
I just want one more thing, not that I have enormous opinions about this or anything, but is being attentive to the property, right? Property is kind of one of settler colonial's tools of control. And if you kind of start thinking about how property and intellectual property and copyright continue to function as tools to dispossess Indigenous people's lands, but also knowledges and cultures and cultural relations, then thinking about the property is going to be pretty central. And where does the control to divest property vest? Like, where does that, how could you transfer of a collection of language materials back to community? That is the decolonial work. It's not just it's not just the policies, it's not just putting the policies in place, it's actively working out how to divest from the property regime, which is deeply tied to the settler colonial structure of control and possession. So I would also suggest that as a starting point.
which is kind of a difficult one, but we're having similar sort of conversations here in New Zealand as well, and conversations with researchers about why is it necessary for sort of the intellectual property to sit with the institution and then get licensed back into the community, and whether it should sit the other way around. Is that, you know, we do a project, invest it with the community, and then it get licensed to us for our use. And what that then requires is a different sort of relationship with that community to ensure that actually that we still get access to the data for future uses. You know, if we're bad to them, then they won't share it with us. And I think that's that kind of claiming of ownership, which means that you don't have to have a relationship to keep acting. But when you change where the property sits, you do have to maintain a relationship in a different way to keep access to that information.
So I think that's going to be it for our panel discussion today. But even just that last bit, it's like, I'm just thinking also like hint, daguerreotypes, hint, like, okay, you published this. Yeah, you published a book to address the daguerreotypes. However, you're still licensing out, you know, these images. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And I think this is such a really important and critical conversation. And I'm very much appreciative as also a Native Hawaiian and as a member of the Navajo Nation, appreciative of the work that you all are doing out there on behalf of all people, specifically those of us within marginalized communities. So mahalo and thank you for being, oh, and one other thing, thank you so much for morning in your respective locations. So we, our audience and Divya and I sincerely appreciate your attendance, and you would have fooled us in terms of, you know, your ability to speak so alertly and succinctly on these topics.
Thank you so much for having us. And I just want to reiterate again how important the work is that you're doing, and these panels that you've put together to have a kind of public conversation about this and what that means. And we're absolutely delighted to be part of that with you.
Much.
Thank you. Divya, did you want to add anything else? Just one last thing before we leave, there's one last panel happening today at 5 Eastern. This will be sort of the rounding out everything and focusing on narrative and how that plays out with Native artists who are grappling with these issues. So thank you all so much. Very appreciative of your time, and we'll see you in a little bit. So mahalo, thank you.
Kia ora.
Yeah.